It's Jan from YouMakeItSimple.com. I love making things from upcycled sweaters, and in today's tutorial I'm going to show you how you can make a sweater for your dog or your cat, all different sizes, from an upcycled sweater. The items and things that you'll need to make your dog sweater is the pattern printed and cut out, a sweater. You can use all types of sweaters. This is a cotton blend sweater, and you can use even a sweatshirt will work. There are two different options to bind the sweater. You can use the existing cuff on the sweater, so you can just cut it out with this existing cuff and the neck cuff, or you can use a strip of fleece. A pair of fabric scissors and some straight pins. You'll also need your sewing machine. You can use a regular straight stitch, or you can use a serger if you have one. So depending on what size your dog is and how big your sweater needs to be, you can use even just scraps of old sweaters for a small dog, or if you have a large dog, you'll need a larger sweater. So gather up your goods and let's get started. To show you how to cut out the sweater, I'm going to show you with a small size. You can see that this sweater has a stripe, so when you are cutting it out, you want to make sure that the stripe, when you fold it in half, that the stripes are lined up. So I fold this piece in half. We are applying this side of the pattern to the fold, and I'm going to line up this corner of the armhole right here in the middle of this red stripe, so that when I do the belly piece to match, I can just line it up with that part of the stripe. So I'm going to use, this was a front piece of the sweater, and this is the sleeve. You can see how just minimal amount of sweater it takes. I'm going to show you on this piece, you could use the cuff edge, but I'm going to show you how to bind it with a fleece binding on this particular sweater, and I'll show you how to use the cuff on another example. So this notch right here needs to line up with wherever you are on the stripes of this pattern. So this corner notch should line up with this notch. So I put it in the middle of that red stripe. And this is again on the fold, doubled. I'll just cut that out. So these pieces will come in handy for other projects. So save those, the cuffs. And I have already cut out my strip, my 2-inch strip of fleece for the binding, for the neck binding and the bottom binding. So for this larger sweater, I have cut it out, and as you can see, I lined the pattern, the bottom part of the pattern up with, so if this were a bigger size, I've lined it right up with the edge there. And I won't have to add the binding there. It's just already nice and attached to that. Since this is a stripe sweater, if this were just a regular full color or other print, smaller print, I could use the bottom part of the belly piece right along the binding as well. But since I needed to match up those corner notches, those places with the stripe, it wouldn't allow me to go clear down to the bottom of the sweater, if that makes sense. So what I've done is just cut it off, and then I'm going to use, I just cut off a piece of the binding from another piece. So if I were to just sew that on, it would be too long. So to accommodate the correct length, I'm going to cut off that amount from the bottom So I can just sew that on there and use this binding piece. You could use fleece if you wanted to too, but you have to finish off the edges. See how that's already fraying, especially a cotton sweater. So I'll show you how to do that in just a minute. So I have my belly piece, my underbelly piece, and the back piece. The first thing that we'll need to do is to bind the edge of the bottom of the belly piece. And we'll do that by applying a piece of fleece. I'm just going to cut it the same length as the sweater. And put the right side, you can decide which side you want to be the right side, and place it down onto the sweater. So the right sides are together, and pin it in place. And I'm just going to sew along the edge there. And the seam allowance is 3/8 of an inch. So I've threaded my machine with the same color of thread, and I'm just going to sew a straight stitch, back stitching at the beginning and the end of the seam. You can see how, flip it over to the back side, the seam is sandwiched in between there, and just pin it in place. Now you can see there's a lot of excess, but we'll just trim that off when we're finished sewing. Now we're going to sew right in the ditch, right along the edge of the binding. Just bring your needle down and make sure it's in that crevice. Back stitch, remove your pins as you sew. So on the back side you'll have all this excess, but we'll just take it over and get our scissors and trim that off. So we're going to trim off that excess. Just lay your scissors flat and make sure that you're not cutting into the fabric on the other side. Just trim off that. And there you have a finished, nice finished edge for the belly piece. So now we're going to sew the neck seam and the side seam. This little edge right here, this corner, is the neck. So I will put that on top, right sides together, and pin that in place. Take it to the sewing machine, and then I'm going to sew a seam right there, back stitching at the beginning and the end of that seam. And then this little notch in your belly piece goes the corner of the back piece. So you'll line that up there. And then we're going to sew from that corner down to the end here and back stitch. And I'm just going to sew right to the corner there. Back stitch. And now for the neck edge, from the corner there to the edge there. So to make sure that the seams do not fray, which this one is already fraying because it has a lot of cotton in it, and if it is a wool sweater and you haven't felted it, those edges will fray. So I'm just going to set my machine for a zigzag stitch, a wide, short length zigzag stitch, and then sew really close to the previous seam that I've already sewn. So my zigzag stitch, I've set it for 3.5 wide and about a 2 in length. And I will back stitch at the beginning and end again. I'm just sewing really close to that seam, but not going over it. As you can see, I have a little zigzag stitch there, and that will keep it from fraying. And I'll do that again with the neck seam. Now, to finish off the armhole so it doesn't fray, I'm going to sew a zigzag around the very edge of the fabric, and then I'll fold it over and top stitch. Now to finish that, I'm just going to fold it under barely, like a 1/4 of an inch, and put it back to a straight stitch, or you could use a zigzag stitch if you wanted to finish off the edge. So I'm just barely folding it under, over. Go back to where you started, back stitch, and you have a nice finished armhole. We'll need to finish off that bottom portion of the belly, of the back piece. So instead of doing another zigzag stitch and another straight stitch, I'm just going to fold it over and do a zigzag stitch to top stitch it. It's optional. So now, before we do the other side seam and neck seam, we're going to apply the neck binding first. So now to apply the neck binding, take your neck binding piece, and you can find how long that piece needs to be on the pattern. Take the binding, fold it in half, and mark that halfway point with a pin. Take this piece, fold the ends together, the neck piece, and mark the halfway point with a pin. Open that up. With right sides together, place that binding down with the pins matching and pin it in place. Now you can see that the binding is shorter than the neck piece. That will give it the stretch that it needs. So we'll take it to the sewing machine, and starting with the ends together, see how that's bigger? So I've adjusted my sewing machine back to a straight stitch. Just line up the ends of the binding and the neck piece. Back stitch. Now again, we're going to just ease that in as we sew. So we'll just stretch it, line up the edges. Before we flip it over and sew the binding like we did the belly piece, we're going to sew our neck seam and our side seam so that we can fold this over and it will be all nice and connected. So line up those points where the binding and the sweater meet and pin it in place. And we're going to just be sewing that short little neck piece, that short little corner right there. So I'm going to put a pin there just to remind me to stop right there. And then find your notch and bring it to the corner edge of the side seam and put a pin in there. We want to leave this section open for the armhole, and then we'll just sew like we did the side seam, lining up the stripes. Making sure when you sew over this that the seam allowance is folded towards the binding on the underside and the top side. Sewing down to that first pin. And back stitching. And then also leave the armhole, starting at the pin. Make sure the edges are lined up. So we'll need to finish off the edges with our zigzag stitch so it doesn't fray. So I'm going to change my settings. And you don't need to overstitch on the binding, so I'm just going to start where the sweater is. Just going to continue on down, finish off right along the edge of that bottom piece. And to finish off that armhole with the zigzag stitch, and then I'm going to top stitch that bottom . So we're just about finished. Now to do the neck, I'm going to fold that to the underside, pin it in place, making sure that that seam allowance is folded up towards the binding. Just go around and fold and pin that in place. You can kind of feel with your fingers if that is folded up or not. Really important that that is not sticking out. And again, we're just going to sew stitch in the ditch right there. Put your presser foot down and then bring your needle down to make sure you're in that little ditch area. And back stitch. Now we're just going to grab our scissors and trim off the excess. Now just trim, carefully trim around, flipping off that excess, making sure you're not cutting into your sweater. So that edge is finished. Now we just need to finish off the bottom edge. So the back piece binding on the bottom, you don't want that to be tight like a neck edge. So I'm going to actually cut that the same exact size in length as the piece itself. So I'll just measure that and cut it. And then I'm just going to apply it right sides together. And since this edge won't fray when we fold that over, it won't matter. If you wanted a more finished look, you could have applied this before we folded that over and top stitched that. But it shouldn't matter and affect that. So that's the small size sweater. I'm going to show you how to use the serger to finish the seams and using an existing bottom cuff and a neck cuff. So since we are using the bottom of the sweater for the belly binding, we're going to do that first. We're going to sew that on there first. So this is the finished edge. This is the raw edge. We'll put the raw edges together. And we want that to be the same length, so I'll just line that up and cut off the excess. And on this sweater, I am going to use the serger, so I'm just going to take that to the serger and sew this piece onto that. Remember, that neck seam is just that little notch at the top of the belly piece. And I'm going to mark with a pin where that is, because it's kind of hard to tell. So we're going to sew from here to here, and then this is the notched edge. This is the area we're going to leave for the arm, and then we'll sew the side seam from here to there. And I'm going to continue on with the serger to finish that edge as well while we're sewing, and then we'll fold that over and top stitch when we're ready. And I'll go up to that corner point where my pin is and my notch and start sewing the side seam there. My seam allowance here, I'm going to try to fold underneath towards the sewing machine so it's lying flat. And even though I'm at the end of that side seam with the other piece, I'm going to continue sewing and just finishing that edge of the bottom side. Now, so I don't have a tail hanging off, I'm going to sew to the end, lift up my needles, lift up my presser foot, flip this around and stick it back underneath the presser foot, put the presser foot down and sew an inch and then about an inch and then clip it off. Then I don't have that tail at the end. And then when I fold that, we'll fold that underneath and just top stitch it in just a bit. So where I am going to use a full complete neck binding, we are at this point going to sew the other side, lining up my stripes, going up to that corner piece. And that's where we'll start the side seam on this edge. Now to finish off the armhole so it doesn't fray, and it's already starting kind of to do that, so we can use the serger, just sewing along, not taking any off, and just finishing that edge. And then we'll top stitch it. So now to apply the neck binding, we have a complete circle, and I am going to use the existing neck of this sweater. So I'm going to cut away ½ inch. I'm going to give myself ½ inch from the edge of the existing sweater neck binding. So we have the tag that we can remove. So we don't want that extra bulk there. So distribute this evenly, fold it in half, and mark the halfway points with a pin. And then fold, line those pins up to get the quarter marks. And we'll do the same thing with the sweater. So line up your seam. And this is the back, center. Fold it in half the other way and line up your pins. Putting right sides together, line them up. You can remove one of the pins, go to the front. And you can see that the neck binding is bigger than the sweater itself, and that's what we want. We want that some stretch. We'll just ease that in and pull as we sew it. You want to make sure you're removing your pins so you don't ruin your knife. There you have your neck. Now to finish the armholes, I'm just going to take it to the single needle machine, fold it underneath, and top stitch. Back stitch at the beginning and the end. Now the last thing we need to do is just finish that bottom edge of the back piece. So we'll just fold that underneath. We've already serged to finish the edge. Just fold that under 1/4 inch and top stitch. The same thing on the other side. Trim all your threads and you'll be finished. There you have it. A couple cute upcycled dog sweaters. If you have any questions while making your sweaters up, please be sure to leave me a note and I'll get back to you. Make sure you're subscribing to my channel and we'll see you in the next class.